Today, I'm excited to welcome back my guest, Jeanne Denney. And Jeanne and I talked, it's now been almost 4 years when we talked about a study she was doing on nonverbal patients. But Jeanne is into a new form of work right now that we're going to talk about today. So I'll tell you a little bit about her. Jeanne is the founding director of the School of Unusual Life Learning, or SoULL, SoULL, a transpersonal and somatic psychotherapist. She's a hospice worker, a healer, and the author of The Effects of Compassionate Presence on the Dying. Jeanne's insights on energy and the body through aging, illness, and dying are derived from a wide lens of human experience and deep understanding of our mortal journey. And you can and should visit her website so that you can learn a lot more about this work she's doing. It's at jeannedenney.com, and that's JeanneDenney, a lot of N's and E's.
That's true.
And learn more about Jeanne's work there. And Jeanne, thank you for joining me. It's so nice to have a chance to talk to you again.
Yeah, thank you, Karen. I'm delighted. Yeah, especially to talk about this work. So let's go.
Yes. I can't wait to dive into it and learn more about it. So from what I understand from reading about your work, you started in end-of-life work and death education, but in the new school that you've created, you're really focusing more on life. Unusual Life Learning is in the name of your school. So maybe you could just give us the big picture in a way for everyone listening. Tell us a little more about your journey, how you first got interested in working with death, and then what led you to this place where you're creating a school about life processes.
Well, that's great. Great question. Actually, my work with death and dying did not start in a vacuum. And as I was first opening up to the experiences and the teachings around death and dying, like many people, it was after my own mother died, and I started as a hospice volunteer. But I had done some healing training, learning about energy and chakras and things like that, human development. And during that same period that I was starting to do death and dying work, I was undergoing a pretty major life change at that time. I had left a career of engineering, bridge engineering, and I'm sorry for that phone call. Do you want to stop it?
Yeah, we could wait. That reminded me. I need to.
Yeah, let me just turn that off. We'll come right back. Hold on.
Yeah, you could just go back to your mom dying. Yeah, I have to move mine out of the room too because I get robocalls all the time.
Prices for TV, phone, and internet have recently dropped as much as 50% and include up to $200. Press 1 to get your free full obligation quote.
Okay. Karen, are you there?
Yes.
I'm so sorry, but it was going to go on and on. So
yeah, no worries. It reminded me to move my phone out of the room too because I get robocalls just constantly.
Yeah, I know. So I'm going to turn my volume down on this, so we won't have that happen again. Hold on 1 second.
And we can just go back to where you were talking about your mom, how everything started when your mom died.
Right. Okay, 1 second. Let me just make sure I have this volume down. It just doesn't want to. All right. Now, hopefully, I can just turn it off if that happens again. It's right here. Okay. So, yeah. All right. Very good. Whenever you're ready, let me know.
Okay. Do you want me to? You can go ahead and just start if you want to start all over with your background.
And the question was about how I got started, right?
Yeah, first in end-of-life work and then moving.
Yeah. Very good. This is a long response, but let's go. Yeah.
Okay. So you can go ahead.
Okay. Well, actually, my work in death and dying didn't start in a vacuum. It started the way many people's work in this field does, and that's after the death of somebody close to them. In my case, it was my mother. And the minute she died, almost within a few weeks, I knew that I needed to leave my career, which I was a bridge engineer, At that time, I already had done some training in healing work, learning about energy and chakras and human development. And I felt a strong call to move in that direction. So really, I began to do hospice volunteering at that point. And I began it with all of my questions about what's really happening here. What is really going on in this process of dying? I would go into the nursing homes after my children were asleep, as I think I might have said in the other interview. And I could see people's bodies changing over periods of time. And it started giving me insights on human development. At the same time, my own children were growing. I had 4 of them. They were probably between about 6 and 13, and their bodies were changing in a different direction. And through this transition, I started to do a graduate degree in transpersonal psychology, a postgraduate program in somatic psychotherapy, which taught me more about human development and energy. I started to do volunteering as a birth doula as well. And somehow between all of those activities, birth, death, growth, decline, spirituality that I was learning about, and all of these things were shaped me together. So they really were not separable from me. And so it's almost impossible for me to tease death education out of life education. I think, in fact, we find they're almost the same things. So that's a start to that question.
Very interesting, and I do agree with you that there's so much. We cannot separate death from life. In fact, they're interwoven, and in some ways, we're putting a big emphasis now on trying to learn about death. But if we're doing that outside the context of life, then we're still missing part of the equation.
Yeah,
and I remember when I first got started in hospice, I had the sense that some of the people who feared death the most were actually people who didn't seem to know what it was like to be really alive. Mm-hmm. And so I was wondering if you have sensed that as well, that there's a question: if we don't understand death, is it because we also don't really understand life and what life is?
Absolutely. I mean, I think any of us that have spent any time in this field, generally there's a trajectory, right? We get excited about the fact that we can even approach death. We learn, we realize we can learn about it, that we get a certain vitality out of doing it, then we can teach others. And then at some point, you, like many other people, Henry Frisco Weiss and many others, Stephen Jenkinson, we come to a point where we realize maybe this basic construct of death versus life is wrong. I mean, we kind of go, wait a second. We're going to death to learn about life. We find ourselves becoming more enlivened by approaching these topics, right? And that's a puzzle, right? And that was, of course, the puzzle I was working on, and it really is embedded into my DNA, really, that whole thing. So I think one of the things we really have to move toward in death and life work is the real understanding that death and life are the same thing. They're made of the same thing. They do not exist without each other, and maybe even why that's so, and how we can work with it.
And so you began as a death educator, and you're now a life educator. And from that perspective, is what you're doing different? Has it changed from being a death educator to a life educator?
Yeah, well, like you say, I almost couldn't do them separately. In fact, it's probably more accurate to say I didn't start as a death educator and become a life. It was more like I was a somatic psychotherapist who did hospice work and death education work with students and others. And I've been trying to build the bridge between them. Both of those fields need what the other one offers. For example, somatic psychotherapy, many people may not know what that is, but that's a kind of psychotherapeutic work that acknowledges the body, the energy system, and is quite effective in helping people work through things, trauma in particular. But in my psychotherapy training, in somatic psychotherapy, there was nothing about life after about age 25 when we're fully developed, as if nothing that happened after 25 was interesting, right? Mm-hmm. And there was a real bias against death, and the real opposition of death versus life was in that field, because was a 20th century idea that sexuality was where life was, that death was the opposite of that. And also in the death education area, we really didn't learn much about the body, and how the body could be really useful. Understanding the body and energy could be really useful to helping people and understanding our own lives. So I think I've been building that bridge between those two bodies of work, and trying to find a way both to teach it, but also a kind of a new theoretical construct for it.
And I wanted to say, I love the fact that you mentioned in discussing your story a little bit that you started out as a bridge engineer, and here you are, you're still building bridges.
Yeah, I just didn't get it on the right level, first of all.
Yeah, but I think that's wonderful. And when I look back to my medical education, and I feel a little bit shocked now in some ways at how little death was ever even addressed or acknowledged in all of the training that I received for all of those years, medical school and residency alike. And I think that has become a huge problem now within our medical system, because we don't have doctors who are trained to know how to embrace dying and death as part of the life cycle of their patients and part of just the natural course of what their patients are going to experience.
Yeah, I like the way you said that, but it's almost as if this idea that we can train doctors, which I think would be useful, truthfully. I mean, I think my friend Leslie Blackhall talks about how little doctors get, maybe a couple of hours in their entire training, if that, as if we could train this. And that's where we come to the school and its ideas in a way, because I think it's more than even training. We actually have to undo some of our understandings about life that we were given, particularly in places like biology classes and medical schools. And those highly scientific views of life that were active in the 20th century and late, probably 19th century, said that death was opposite of life. That really got imprinted. And once you begin to adopt that idea that life is on one side, death is on the other, there becomes this very sharp edge between them. And you work like heck to stay away from that edge, right? Mm-hmm. And that's a very, very different point of view than the idea that life is the thing that moves things in and out of forms and back in some kind of natural way. That's an entirely different worldview, in fact. So how do we get under the worldview? It isn't probably just a couple of hours of training, even though that would be useful. The worldview itself is what leads us to the ICU death, truthfully, that nobody really wants to have.
It's so true. And that worldview, it's cultural, it's societal, it's ingrained in each and every one of us. And we really have to confront it within ourselves. I think if we want to try to change how we're approaching the end of life and life in general for our patients or for people that we work with.
Yeah, absolutely. And then the question becomes, and this is exactly kind of the path that I walked, like you, through, why is it this way? And why is it that way? And couldn't this be better? And I think ultimately I came to the idea that what was needed was a way to teach people how to see things from that different worldview. Not just even the idea that there's a different worldview, which, many people listening to this podcast would probably agree with, but how we actually feel that in our bodies, experience our vitality, understand our vitality, and work with our own resistance to death that's been given to us in the culture.
And I gathered from your website that you talk a lot about the problems that arise from our separation from the natural world. And I was wondering if you talk about that a little bit more, and also about how you address that in your school.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, nature is the classroom for teaching about life, period. It is the classroom. So, but let's just think about nature for a minute. I mean, one of the principles of nature is that things die. I mean, that's a core principle, that things pulsate, and that means they expand and they contract, right? And they do that with some kind of fluidity, and I think that's what we call naturalness, that we have ease with change. We can flow. We can transform with grace, usually, some of the time at least. And that's what naturalness kind of is, authenticity. We don't resist movement. The minute we oppose dying processes or expansion processes from contraction processes, let's say, like growth from aging, the minute we make those very separate things, we start to resist one of them. And that almost creates this artificiality in our system. We become, all kinds of things are connected to that in our own bodies, in our minds, in our emotional systems, and our environment, our politics, and our medicine. It becomes very vast when you watch what it means to separate death from life. I hope this is making sense.
Yeah, well, I can see that our own resistance to seeing our own death as part of life causes us to view ourselves as separate from or different from the natural world, because we can look at nature and it's obvious that death is part of life in nature, but we really don't want to see that within ourselves.
Correct, yeah. And that's a picture of how much we've separated ourselves from nature, mainly because of this fear of death thing, as far as I can see. And it causes so many issues, not just at bedside, where many death doulas and death hospice workers and so on experience it, not just in grieving processes, all through the lifespan. And that's where being a somatic psychotherapist at the same time really showed me that this was not a deathbed issue. It was not an issue that just comes up when you get a difficult diagnosis or somebody dies in your life. This is actually something that's behind the anxiety of people in their 20s, people that are suicidal, all kinds of life issues that we see, and people in a lot of torment because of really the wrong ideas about this and who they are, not being disconnected from their authenticity, their body, their truth. And so the school I'm creating anyway is one of the ways that I'm trying to address that in a context that helps people go quite a bit further into connecting with themselves.
And so do you actually spend time in nature with your students during your classes?
Yeah, actually. Well, I set up, the question was, how am I going to teach this, right? I mean, how do you set up a context people are willing to come to, make it enough of a commitment to, and not overwhelm, not overwhelm. And so I started with a 3-weekend structure with some online education in between. Now, I want to point out that it really does require some thinking to undo the thinking we have. We have to first become aware of what we think that we don't even know we think about life and death, and then start to recognize how it's running our system. And that takes some lecture and, the usual kind of workshop interactions and experimentation and self-reflection. But there's 2 ways I think I really try to help people experience these ideas. And that's through experiential work, no matter where we are, in the house that I teach in or outside, but also in people's reflection in the natural world. That's a requirement of the course, is you really do start to examine your relationship with nature in a variety of ways. And we do, we try to be outside for exercises as much as we can. So we start to break down that artificial wall.
That sounds very interesting. And I like the fact that you emphasize that it does take some work for us to recognize the mindset we've been taught or that has been ingrained in us through our society, and that it takes a little bit of sussing out in a way in order to see the effects of that in our own lives.
Yeah, it really does. And yet I'm surprised in another way how easy it is. And if you'd like, I'll give you an example.
Yeah.
And I start most of the teachings with this. So this is a spoiler alert here. But and I have for years. I tell a story about teaching at Ramapo College when I was an adjunct there, teaching death and dying. And I wanted the students who thought that this class was going to be about trauma, generally, when they came in, I wanted them to get a sense of the naturalness of both dying, but also of life movement. And so I had this idea, I'm going to show them time-lapse videos of plants, because plants stay put, and we get these wonderful videos showing life moving through things. A life force has a pattern, and something about that is so resonant for us that we feel it, when we watch time-lapse videos. So that was my idea, and I got online and started looking for time-lapse videos to show the naturalness of the expansion to the contraction and how easy it was. Well, guess what I found? I found that, of the 330,000 videos that came up on flowers growing or whatever I searched, and many other searches, almost all of them only showed you the plant growing to the point of its maximum bloom, say the flower opening. Right at the point where the flower might start to contract, the videographer would cut and start another flower blooming. If you can imagine this, you see nothing in the flower itself was doing that. That was our projection about what life was. And that it was so, it was so common. It was as if all the videographers signed a contract that said they would not let us see the moment when that flower starts to contract. But also there were a small number of videos that would show flowers dying, and that also had our images of trauma and sadness and collapse in them. And so it was a big projection screen, right, of our culture's ideas about these processes. And now I'm forgetting the question that you started me with, but this was about, teaching about life movement. Where did I start with that, Karen? We might have to cut this part out.
That's all right. I'll just cut our little chat here. But I wanted to say that I find that so fascinating, and in many ways not surprising at all. It makes sense to me that we prefer not to look at the decline and the deterioration that happens.
Oh, I just found my thread, so I can go back in. Yeah. And it's interesting that it isn't. It's the moment between expansion and contraction that seems the most charged for people. Like that, I even found videos that showed the expansion and showed the contraction, but they interrupted the moment when it changed, as if these are two separate processes. That life versus death thing came right through in the videography. So I show this to students, and I say, look, this is what I found, and everybody recognizes it. And I say this is in all of our advertising, all of our processes. We are carrying this inner idea, and it's being reinforced to us daily. But all it takes is for me to find one video to show them that just shows them enough of the full life movement that instantly in their bodies they can feel that relief. And that sometimes those little talks that I do, people have big changes from that. So it can take a lot, but the art is in helping people really connect with their life as the movement of energy within them happening right now, not off someday in the future, they're going to become spirit or something. It's happening now. And I think that learning how to teach people that has been where I've gone with this work.
And as you were talking there, I was reminded of a hospice patient I worked with once who asked me, when do I stop living and start dying? Would you tell me when that happens and like when that changes? And I said, wait a minute. I said, you're doing both at the same time. You're living, all of us, we're living, but we're also dying in some ways. Those two processes are happening at the same time. And she said, no, they're not. And
right.
She said, and I just want to know when I make that transition. And I couldn't get through to her that they were not two separate processes, just as you're
absolutely. Yeah. And when you start looking deeply, and that's of course what we're trying to do in this project, when you start looking deeply, it becomes clear. But you can hear in that life versus death, that we think that life is growth and expansion phase, and that death is anything other than that. And that actually, I often put up the Biology Online dictionary definition of life. And that one says that life is a characteristic of matter, basically. And it was characterized by growth, by reproductive ability, by metabolism, ability to adjust to stimuli, and adaptability, those 5 things. Now, I want to ask you, if you're an older person, you're no longer growing in the way we use that word physically, your metabolism is slowing down, you're not reproducing anymore, you're not adapting as easily, you may not even be responding as quickly to things, right? Mm-hmm. Why wouldn't we feel like we're becoming less alive if that's our definition? And of course, people are going to be in crisis about it. But when we shift to a definition of life that includes life force movement, the awareness of life force movement and life as energy in motion, that entirely shifts.
I love that term, life force movement. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I mean, I do talk about it, and I think that people often just have big question marks on their faces when I say it because it's so alien to us. Life force movement. First of all, what's a life force? I've never heard of that, right? And science would say there's no such thing as life force. And yet, if we watch those time-lapse videos of flowers growing, we can absolutely see that there's a force pushing matter upwards. Something's happening, right? So I think that this is a basic kinesthetic sense that has been almost interrupted in us. It's natural for us to have a kinesthetic sense of life force movement. And yet in our culture, we're almost hindered by not having it. I think other cultures, tribal cultures and indigenous cultures often made sure that people understood and could experience the rhythm of life and understood the cyclical nature of life. But in ours, it's almost as if we avoid or we try to make sure we don't put those pieces together. I don't know why, but it causes a lot of problems. I would say that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very true. And I have to admit, I've experienced it over and over again. And I'm only just now, after reading your material, beginning to look at how has this mindset influenced me as much as I myself try to teach about the cycle of life. And, life encompasses both birth and death, but are there ways that I'm even blind to within myself that I've been affected by this split between living and dying?
Yeah, it's amazing, right? It one of those remarkable things to me is that once we start changing our ideas, and I, of course, like to do this in group settings so that we can really reinforce each other and be helped by it. But once we start doing it, our bodies itself start to recognize our awareness. It's amazing. As one of my students said, it's as if I'm wired to know about this life force awareness thing, But the switches were all turned off. And in doing this study, they were turned back on. And it's gradual. It keeps sinking in and sinking in. And it's an ongoing process. As another student likes to say, it goes well beyond the 6 months of study. It keeps, like rich soil, it just keeps feeding you. I think that's true. That's what a true initiation is like.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So, Jeanne, do you feel that the teaching that you're doing, the somatic education and the unusual life learning, do you feel like it would be beneficial for people who do end-of-life work?
Oh, absolutely. Any kind of life work, because I think, honestly, often death and dying folks work very much by themselves, and can be, for one thing, I think it can be really hard to be in isolation and not understand the energetic dynamics of what you encounter every day with either patients, if you're in an agency, or in relationship dynamics with people dying. It gives you an incredible insight on what the dynamics are. Let me just give you an example. My friend Amy Cunningham, who I'm sure you've interviewed, who's a mortician in Brooklyn, she came to one of our weekends, and we learned just a little bit about the energetics of relationships between people and how they change through death. And Amy took that idea of the chords back, and she had used it many times with families, just helping them describe what's happening to them. And for example, in grief, why is it that our bodies are so impacted by another person's death? There are so many ways, and I probably could give you more examples, just how you work with a dying patient and so on. But we just, this first 6 months program, we just try to give, I say the goal is to give you a new life language. And then in year 2, we're really taking it into applications. And I will be very excited to get some folks working actively in death and dying in that year 2, which I don't have yet.
And I wonder if I'm thinking about some questions I've been asked by family members who are caring for a patient with Alzheimer's and who have felt that they can no longer relate to their loved one. They can't feel a connection anymore to their loved one. And it sounds to me like they could use some of the work that you're doing to help them still sense the life force in their loved one, even though their mental abilities have changed to still feel.
Yes, yeah. Well, even though I probably at this point wouldn't teach, say, a death doula what to do, I think what the school's doing is giving you tools so that you can see what's needed and enter into a situation like, say, a couple in that situation and help them. And I'm happy to give an example of somebody I did that with recently, in which I was able to just help him understand that there were levels that they could still relate on, even if the ones that we're attached to and used to are gone. And sitting them together with a little bit of music, maybe helping the partner of the Alzheimer's patient go into a meditative state and find each other, things like that. I think we can think of things like that to do when we understand a little bit more about what the actual processes are that they're going through in changing their relationship and their contracts with each other. And that's been really helpful to people, just to have and experience a connection again.
And I can see some reflections of the work we talked about in our initial interview, the study that you were doing on, I think, connections with nonverbal patients.
Yes.
And I can see the same thing. It's being able to sense that energetic bond that is still there through everything, and knowing how to become aware of it.
Yeah. Well, I think there are actually technical aspects to it, actually. That we have to learn, just like you learned your medical training. We tend to become a little amorphous when we're talking about these things and, relationships at end of life. We know that we're in the presence of mystery. We know that energy happens and that things influence each other. But sometimes it's good to understand that there's actual kind of processes. One thing happens before the other, and this is what helps that. And, just briefly, since we're talking about death and dying work, and of course, it's not confined to death and dying work, what I'm saying. But for example, if you are with a patient who's non-communicative, and of course, they taught me an enormous amount about this. You're with someone who's struggling, say. You may not even know them very well, but you could tell they're struggling to really climb the ladder energetically to get out of their body. Energy from other people can help you. And even though a person might be trying to bring their energy up to the upper body, generally we think of it in death, sometimes pulling their energy down to their feet can be really helpful. And for example, and knowing that helping them come back down and ground for a moment and come back in, I call that the slingshot, can sometimes help people go back up, if I'm making sense. So seeing that pulsation within the dying process, that teaches me a lot about how people are in ordinary life too. So we look at those patterns, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So I can definitely see the applications of this training and how valuable it could be, especially because many times in end-of-life work, we're trained for certain standard situations that we can expect, but most often we end up encountering unusual situations and circumstances when we feel like I actually have no idea what to do, no idea how to help here, but having more tools to offer and a new mindset in way for how to look at what's happening, I think could be so helpful.
Exactly. It helps you stay more present and get more curious in a really positive way. Where you can find things to do rather than feeling lost, for example. Like I always loved it when I didn't have a standard situation. Those taught me the most, right? Or something unexpected happened.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, exactly. That's what stretches us the most and allows us to be the most creative too.
Well, isn't it something we love about death work too? Those of us that have done it for years or spent years doing it, that it teaches us about life. It's a marvelous teacher. It taught me almost everything, I guess that's where I got started.
Yeah. Well, so one big concern I still have that I see changing only very, very slowly is the medical system itself and how we fail to approach the end of life, I think, in any reasonable way, how patients were using technology to prolong life, but we're actually prolonging the dying process at the same time. Yeah. And I don't even know, where can we begin within our medical system to try to change that mindset? Do you have, other than sending everyone through your class?
Well, bring them on. I actually in Krakow, Poland, I was teaching, working with aging, illness, and dying in January. And I had 3 physicians and a dentist and some nurses in there. And it was so wonderful. They were so amazed, actually. They were open to it. I guess that's what it's going to take. It's just having people with a new vocabulary about what's going on here. What's going on here is not necessarily biochemical or pulse rate or, all the measurements we're doing, although that's certainly true and helpful sometimes. But when we can back up and look at it as a process of that's a normal process, a process we might be trying to help, we can bring that technical mind into a different direction that is more helpful. And I guess this is the technician in me coming out, but we have to have more rigorous ideas about energy and the body and to create a technology that's more humane. We have to have a different idea about what life is and stop opposing it from death to start creating a technology that's humane.
So true, because right now our medical system is really serving that split between living and dying. It's focusing solely on living and fostering the split. I have always had this fantasy of what if primary care doctors were trained to the first visit with a patient to say, I'm actually here to teach you about the cycle of life and death, and that life contains death, and that all of us will die one day. And it's really important in your medical care that you understand that. I'll be giving you things that will support your life, but we are not doing that to prevent your death, because we can't. These are all wrapped up. Like, what if doctors said that? And then I realized how far away we are from that actually being a reality.
Right. Yeah, it reminds me of another thing that I actually do say sometimes when I have the opportunity to work with somebody who's got serious cancer, and this life versus death comes up about, do I do more treatments or do I give up? Right? I'm sure you've had that many times. Like, do I fight or do I surrender? You know? And it's like, wait a second. No, actually, you start getting ready for your dying, because every single thing you do for your dying is going to help your healing. It can't be different. They're not separate processes. So I always encourage people, plan for your death. Absolutely. That's not being negative. Everybody should do it. And you'll find exactly what you need to correct in your life. Sometimes that can start a healing process, right? In the body. So the body knows about all these things and may actually be suffering from our misguided ideas about, death.
So it's so true. It's so true. I was just thinking of my mother, who at one point in her life, she had developed some health problems and wasn't able to walk anymore, and had kind of decided, I'm done with life. I don't want to be alive anymore. She started planning for her death. She started planning her funeral, and she actually really enjoyed it.
Yeah.
It led to many conversations between us about death and dying, and about life as well. She lived for 5 years, and in some ways they were the best 5 years of her later life that she had ever had, because once she addressed death, she felt this huge freedom, like this weight came off of her shoulders, and she was able to really enjoy the things that she was still able to do, and the parts of her life that were still available to her.
Yeah, and she probably had a little bit of an insight as to what her priorities were too, which, think about everything you just said, how much that enhances our health and vitality, to do the things we love, to be clear about what we actually enjoy and what's important to us, what actually enhances our vitality. It's, these are the ways we learn that death and life are not oppositional. In fact, they are by necessity the same process in a way. They just are moving perhaps in, two different directions or something.
I think that's such an important message, because often I think those of us who do death work and work in the end of life arena, we're focusing on, here's why you need to look at death, because it will make your last days, your end of life better. Your dying process will be better if you look at death now. But we should actually be including, it's going to make your life be better right now and for however many days you have it. And that's why people should start doing it at a younger age, in fact, and not wait until a month before.
Absolutely. I mean, right. Here's another piece I'm sure is true for you too, Karen, not to assume, but I know that for me, one of the big ahas was getting into hospice work and realizing that there was a lot I could not do in the period that I had to work with people, because there was so much that hadn't been thought about. And that period of time was just not an optimum time to open up those questions. That's what turns you from a hospice worker to a death educator, where you want to go work with 21-year-olds who, by the way, are very anxious to hear about all this. And so it's what makes you see there's no special time in life to be learning this. Oh, I'll wait till after I'm 75. Oh, I'll wait till I'm sick. In Tibet, this is the ABCs for children, as the Dalai Lama says. So these are our ABCs, to learn that we're part of nature, to learn that this is part of our nature, and to learn how to work with it skillfully.
So true. Oh, wow. We have such a long way to go, but I'm really excited to hear about what you're doing, because it seems like this is groundbreaking. I haven't seen much else out there offering this kind of training that you're doing.
Yeah, that's kind of true. I think that's why I call it unusual. It's hard for people to get their head around what I'm doing because we do split these things off from each other so much. I do think there is an aspect here which I'm bringing together two fields that haven't been in this kind of contact in our Western culture, since we've had modern science, let's just say, or psychology. So I think that it's extremely fertile ground for learning for all kinds of people that work with people. And for example, I have one student young person who's getting her MSW, is working in a grade school with children coming in with all of their angst about life in the world. How are they going to grow up? They feel the climate crisis. And because of our work, she's able to work with plants with them and talk to them about it in a way without maybe joining their trauma in the same way. There's so many applications we can make from basic different vocabulary and understanding about life.
So you mentioned teachers and you've mentioned healthcare professionals. Who do you feel that your training is right for?
Well, one of my students says, just human beings. And that is kind of true. Although I have to say the people that are most attracted to it, it's not any demographic in terms of profession or age. But I think that I call it wisdom keepers, healers, creatives tend to be drawn to it. They're working on these issues anyway. And people in human service work certainly should be thinking about what they're doing, I hope. But the people that have these certain quality of question open, and you could be very young, you could be 18 years old and have this burning question open for you. And it doesn't matter, whether you know anything about anything, you can come and understand this course. Actually, one of my beloved teachers, myself from years ago of somatics, and one of my teachers of presence, cellular presence work, Marcus Daniels, surprised me by coming to be a student last year. And he had spent 30 years with Tibetan Lamas, a pretty hardcore study with them. And he said, I got things from this course I did not get from 30 years with the Lamas about death and dying and vitality. So I'm not saying that to boast, but I think it's just simply that's the range, right? From, say, a young person or a millennial who's kind of in life crisis to this very seasoned teacher. And everyone kind of can get it. So I think it's more where your questions are, what's drawing you, and whether you're really curious about this connection and longing to connect these ideas.
Mm-hmm. And so it sounds like many of the attendees are people in some sort of a helping profession who work with other people who might be looking at this course as a way to have more tools available for their work. But in the process of it, they may find that they themselves are totally changed by
exactly. That's exactly it. And yeah, so, and that was a surprise for me. Okay. So when I first started, I just was wondering why we weren't talking about death and dying and somatic psychology. So I got some colleagues together for a weekend and said, okay, surely they've thought about it too, and we'll get together and brainstorm and I'll show them what I'm doing. Well, it turns out they just didn't have very many things. They shared experiences, of course, and it was wonderful, but I ended up teaching this material for the first time. And my big shock was 2 weeks later, I had a Zoom call where I said, so where did you go with what we did? And almost to a person, people said it completely changed my life and talked about all the personal changes that had happened to them. And the help, of course, it went into their work, which is probably why they came there in the first place. But they received so much on the personal level that allowed them to be so much more comfortable with the other people's life processes too. So it's our own comfort with our own life movement that's going to make us skilled enough to be with other people's life processes with confidence, right? Mm-hmm. And that's, I think, the primary gift of that first 6 months. Even if you just come to the first weekend, which it's possible for people to do that, just come for one weekend, I think you get that feeling.
Yeah, tell us a little bit more about how the course is structured.
Yeah, sure. Well, because I work with nature, I like to work with the seasons as much as I can. And so I start in the spring with the first weekend, which I call the Nature of Being Human. And in that weekend, we work with a lot of the things we've been talking about in this interview, about how the body is formed, how we start to age, and the dying process, and what dying people show us, and the energetics of dying, and so on. We get on the floor. Every day we do some practice with dying, visceral practices, so we can really see how much this is nested in our own body now and expand that capacity. That's weekend one, and it's a lot. But we know very well that nobody's dying process, nobody dies completely alone, right? Or if they do, there are relationships somewhere that they're in conversation with. So relationships are a very big part of dying. And in weekend two, which usually takes place a couple months later, and during that 2 months, we have online dialogues and discussions and homework, weekly homework if you want to do it, that helps you anchor the weekend one teaching. In weekend two, we look at the structure of relationships, the nature of relationship. And we find that relationships have their own life force, they have their own way of coming into being, and that they have their own rhythm, they have their own patterns. And that when people are dying, they have characteristic ways that we let go of certain of our energy attachments to people. And that's a lot of teaching to do that weekend, and we experiment with that. And so that's the second weekend, about 2 months later, or 2.5, 3, depends on the year. That's in the summer. So we are sometimes out roaming around outside doing experiments on relationship. And then we have another couple of months to integrate that. And the third weekend, we also know that there's something about community in the dying process too, about a community receiving who we've been, and something that the dying person can give to a community that's almost like food for our connections with each other. And that's a mystery I was really fascinated with. And so I knew that there was a community aspect to our life changes and what helps us bond and connect and understand who we are in this world. So that's what we look at in the third weekend. It's almost infinitely hard to get your head around that, but I think we can learn a few processes about how groups work, how all of these energies start to make sense together. And that's pretty big when you start seeing how your family dynamics and then also your community dynamics are. And then usually that's the end. Then we have a little discussion afterwards to see how everybody's landing. And then people go into a very quiet place, usually at the end of the program. And I consider that the final part in the winter, where we go in to really integrate the material. That's the program.
Wow, that sounds amazing. And so where do you teach this? Where would people need to travel to in order to take the class?
Well, I've been teaching it in New York. However, I just relocated to Wisconsin, and I'm trying to establish this program here. So what I'm doing is teaching the first weekend in April, mid-April, I think it's the 16th through the 19th in New York, at Stony Point Center this year, coming up. And I'll be doing the weekend one in May, mid-May, here in Wisconsin. I live in Racine, in the Chicago-Milwaukee kind of corridor. And then there will be the second and third weekends will be here in Wisconsin. I hope people who want to do that might be willing to travel. I will also be doing a weekend one on Whidbey Island outside of Seattle in September. So the idea being, if I can bring that first weekend to people, that's a benefit very often for folks. And for some people, that's quite enough. And those that really want to take it deeper can keep going.
Oh, so that's interesting. So some people could just sign up for one weekend, either in New York City, in Wisconsin, or Seattle, and take the first weekend experience. And, as you said, for some, that might be plenty to integrate
exactly.
and digest in the beginning.
Yeah, that's right. Yes, I think that I realized that through teaching that it was good to have the option of letting people stick their toe in. I know that it's a lot to consider doing 3 days with strangers and traveling to it, but it is well worth the experience, I think, for most people, almost everybody I've worked with for that first weekend. It's very helpful. So it's an offering for those that are called. And the questions only deepen, but it's available if people want to shift their language.
How do students sign up for it if someone listening is interested?
Yeah, they can drop me personally an email, for one thing. That's my name, Jeanne Denney, and you spelled it at the beginning of the interview, JeanneDenney. But you can Google me. I'm sure you can find my website. And look up under the school, too, if you'd like to. On my website, JeanneDenney.com, there is a page on the school. And there is certainly an email contact in there. Just reach out, say I'm interested. I'm happy to set up a conversation with anybody that would like to find out more or just to explore if it's the right time for them to do this. So it would be good for people to do that soon. Early bird registration is coming up in early March and early April for both of those New York and Wisconsin dates. But would love to have some death and dying folks with these questions. And
I can just imagine some people listening feeling called to this, because maybe people who've been working in the death and dying field for a while and have felt in their hearts that something is missing in the work they do or the way they've been trained in the work they're doing. And that it sounds like this would certainly be a rich experience to help them come back home again, in a way, to their own bodies and connect more deeply.
That is true. I find for people that are really doing a lot of hospice work or death and dying work that it's important. The community aspect is important because often we don't get it in our work environments. I sometimes say, there should be OSHA regulations about doing death and dying work the way we're doing it energetically. We deplete people and burn them out so quickly. And there are reasons why. In SoULL, we really are looking at what are those energetic dynamics that burn people out so radically. We should be doing this in groups, not just as individuals going in and really processing our experiences and making sense and meaning out of what we're seeing. Those are very deep and important aspects to the work and self-care. It isn't just getting a massage now and then or getting your nails done or going on vacation. It's understanding these deep energetic processes we're in the middle of. So yes, I would love to see one day us doing this, maybe even entirely for a group of death and dying workers. But right now we mix it up with all kinds of people, and I welcome everybody. Pretty much. Unless you're in active crisis, then I don't know if it's the best thing for you at this moment. But otherwise, I'm happy to speak with mere mortals.
Well, it sounds amazing. Yeah, it's very, very appealing to me. So,
well, come, Karen. You can come.
I'm really excited about what you're doing, and really impressed that you've you've created all this, and had the inspiration for it, and you've actually done it and put it all together.
Thank you so much. And I just want to compliment you too for giving a platform like this to speak about it. We've had a wonderful hour conversation, and so often people want you to put things in very tiny sound bites. And actually, I just find that this particular work, it's very difficult to do that. So I just want to thank you for the service that you're doing too.
Oh, well, you're so welcome. And yeah, and thanks for giving me your time so that we could talk about it, and hopefully we've gotten the message out to some people who know that it's the right thing for them. So
yes, this work goes based on calling. I'm not trying to sell a program. I'm trying to make a resource available. So for people that are really feeling that tickle of longing, that's who it's for.
Absolutely.
So, yeah.
Well, so I'll just remind people to go to your website, JeanneDenney.com, and I will put a link to it in the show notes for this episode, which are at EOLUpodcast.com. And you'll find links to Jeanne's website and the school, kind of all the basic things we've talked about here on that page as well. Well, Jeanne, good luck, and you'll soon be starting your spring weekend. So
yep, they're coming up. So there's still time to jump on board. Yeah. Thank you so much, Karen.
Oh, thank you. Take care.
All right.
Bye.